Welcome to the Otherweb. Our guest today is Christopher Six, the managing editor for WYDaily. Chris is a passionate advocate of community journalism with more than 30 years in the media, corporate communications, and marketing space, and an award-winning columnist, editor, and newsroom leader. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining. So you've been in local media for a while now, and you run a local newsroom right now, but it seems like local media is not doing so well. What do you think is going on?
Well, there's a number of things. Yeah, you're right. I've been in this business now for more than 30 years, which is somewhat hard to accept sometimes because I still feel like a youngster. But I've seen a lot of it develop over time. I started at a very small newspaper in Pennsylvania, in a city that newspaper doesn't exist anymore. And at that time, we were already starting to feel some of the crunches, things that were going on. Some of it is just the cost of resources. A big part of it was a change in how people digest their news, and there have been some outside influences as well. And I think some things that we've done on our own where we've kind of shot ourselves in the foot. A big one for that early period in the 90s was the emergence of the internet as a tool for everyone. And it was something that we found as a legacy newspaper very difficult to sell to our clients. We would say to them, hey, you got to get advertising on our website. And they'd be like, who looks at that? We want our big full page display ads. So we began to package things in and say, well, we'll give you a free ad on the web if, you buy a full page ad. And that was great until they figured out that it was more cost effective to be advertising on the internet and they were getting it for free. So why did they want to pay for it now? And we had a system that was set up that was, very good for setting advertising rates based on circulation and things. And one of the things that I've come across a lot of newspaper advocates have been saying in the past several years is that those rate cards never really were updated after, say, the year 2000, because as things moved to the internet, it just threw everything off. Another thing that really hit us hard was that a lot of newspapers, a lot of families that own newspapers decided in the early 2000s when mortgage rates were really great to build giant new printing facilities to replace their 80, 90, 100-year-old printing presses. And the thought was, boy, we're just going to make a killing because we'll also become a printing business and print products for other people. So that, when things changed in the real estate market, a lot of those families were left holding these mortgages they couldn't pay on these properties. And so they started selling. And, you saw family businesses selling to, ultimately, hedge funds were very popular. And one of the largest is one that owns a couple of papers I used to work at. They own pretty much all of the newspapers in the lower end of this peninsula. I'm in Williamsburg. They own the print newspaper in Williamsburg, the Daily Press in Hampton, and the Virginian Pilot. And what they're very good at, as a friend of mine says, they're very good at doing what they're designed to do, which is to make a lot of money, but not really invest a lot of it into the business. So you're seeing staffs slashed, you're seeing the newspaper offices, the buildings themselves being sold off. So all that really, there was this whole changing atmosphere. And the way that people consume their news changed. It went first to the website, and then it went to social media. And it's very hard to play in that sandbox when you're a legacy newspaper. So it's one of the things that ultimately drew me to where I'm at working for a digital newspaper, because we don't have a lot of those, we don't have the costs of print paper, which was another thing that hit this industry hard in the early years of the Trump administration when he put the tariffs on Canadian paper. Well, guess who used used a lot of Canadian paper was this industry. And it got to a point, I mean, a lot of my numbers now are getting a little on the older side. They don't necessarily always take the pandemic into consideration, but there's another big one. But we were to a point by the close of the 2019, we had lost something like 2,400 newspapers across the country. And it's because we were on shoestring budgets to begin with. We needed that advertising money to come in so we could pay the print costs so that we could print a paper so we get the advertising money to come in. And it just became a real cyclical problem. The other part was there have been changes in the way people report the news. And it's something that I've seen a lot of. And I know there's something that you've talked about, having listened to a few of your podcasts. That there are one of my favorite phrases that I hope I created. So it was opinion masquerading as news analysis. Where I came up, it was about they talk, you write it down, you print it, you put in a little stuff to give it, information, to give it grounding so you know where it's coming from and what's going on. But we really got into, as an industry, these think pieces that are, really open for interpretation, and that's where you get into the questions of bias and things like that. I think that all journalists are biased. There's nothing you can do about it. You're biased by where you were raised, how your family was, where you went to school. I'm a middle-aged white guy who went to a rural school in Pennsylvania. I bring biases to the table. What we used to do is we used to try to check those at the door and challenge ourselves. And I think that we became more interested in crusading than we did about reporting. I don't see as much of that on the local level as I do on the national level, but it does get in there. The younger writers that I've worked with, I've really had to work with them. You can't say that. They can say that, and we can say that they said that, but you can't say that. That's for something else. And it's funny for me to say that because I've spent a lot of my career writing commentary, but I've really gotten away from that in recent years, and I've really become an advocate for newspapers, and for us, a digital newspaper that really doesn't get into opinion at all. We don't run letters to the editor here. And I think that's a good thing. We have commentary on our social networks, but you can't really do much about that. But, we try to really just play it straight and try to get it, get input from everyone who will talk to us. I told you I can ramble.
There's a lot to unpack here, so I want to break it down into sort of bite-sized chunks and try to dig into each one. First of all, about bias, I kind of have to comment here that I'm Israeli. And so now the big topic in the news is one that I am very biased in. Right. And so I have to be very careful to never touch anything that might affect our editorial policies on this topic because I don't trust myself on it.
Right.
And it seems like that is not the approach that most people who have biases take. They just assume their bias happens to be the truth and everybody else's bias is bad. Right. My assumption is I can't be trusted on this topic, so our editor in London takes over on this one.
Right.
And I just don't touch it because, again, it is very hard for me, as much as I can steelman any side, I think, to really steelman this particular side because I grew up there. All right, going back to the business side of things, and I want to put my MBA hat on.
Okay.
I hear a lot of talk about monetization in the news industry, right? So you mentioned advertising basically as the first part of this discussion of what went wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And I keep thinking, if you have 4 different ways to monetize a product and none of them are driving enough revenue to cover your costs, you don't have a monetization problem. Your product isn't worth what you think it's worth.
Yes.
Right? Am I misreading this? Or is it perhaps the case that when the internet came about, news actually became worth less because now it's so much easier to find. And so people are finding so many things that are basically fungible?
I think that there's a lot to that. I think that what legacy news organizations can offer is a level of credibility that you can't get elsewhere. But I do think that one of the arguments that I make when my stump speech, when I talk to organizations, is, and they talk about it a lot now, that news is so important it should be subsidized, that it's like a utility. And maybe I'm just an old person who just can't wrap my head around that, or it's because I'm a capitalist and I don't apologize for that. I think you should be, if I believe that you should be creating a product that people want to purchase. And if you're subsidizing it, then you're just taking money from people in another way to make them buy something that they decided they don't want to buy in the first place. I am a big fan of newspapers. I have been all my life. Personally, I don't have a print subscription to a newspaper anymore. I do have digital subscriptions, and some of them are worth it to me. I do think that unless you're separating yourself and showing that you have something that people are willing to put money out for, you have to change the business model if it's not working. That's one of the things that works for us where I'm at now. We're tied to a radio station, so they can package advertising. But two, we're a destination that people go to. So where our bread and butter is our income from advertising, because people come to our site and people read our newsletter. So in that sense, we have a model that's working,
But also, I'm assuming perhaps your cost of production, again, speaking in MBA terms, is not as high as the cost of producing a print newspaper, and possibly your content is more unique, right?
I would say all that's the case. We're not. When I was at my last weekly, it was costing us $3,000 a week to print. I'm sure that's more expensive now, because that was almost 6-7 years ago, I guess. We don't have that cost. We can invest that into our most costly resource, human resources. I have probably the largest news staff I've had in a long time, so we can gather more news. And we're hyper local too in our focus. We really focus on what we call the historic triangle here. So, which is Jamestown, Yorktown, Williamsburg, and because of that, we offer product that people find sometimes indispensable, if I can brag a little bit. But but we were able to do that because we didn't have, when it was laid out, when it was formed, and this predated me, they didn't have the legacy costs of an expensive newsroom, an old building, a press, or a contract with somebody to print, and all the content, all the costs that go with that, plus the things you don't think about, like people the truck drivers to take the papers out, people to deliver on the rural routes. All that's off the boards for us, which makes it a much more lucrative model for us.
Well, so the online only, I can understand why it makes more sense than print. But you mentioned the biggest cost driver, which is people. And then in the same breath, you mentioned, so we're sending more people to gather more news, right?
Uh-huh.
Which seems like a great use of people. That's something people are uniquely skilled at.
Uh-huh.
But it seems like that's not what most of the industry is doing. If I search any event right now on Bing News on a national level, I'm going to find both national and local outlets writing basically the same article about the same fact pattern, but clearly each one was written from scratch by another person. And so you had 50 people do the exact same work.
Uh-huh.
That does not seem like a smart use of resources. They could have been trying to find some new facts, but instead they were writing about the same ones. I actually had Professor Jeff Jarvis on the show a couple of episodes ago, and he talked about the BuzzFeed dress episode. And at some point he was giving a talk to a bunch of journalists, and he asked, how many outlets here wrote an article about the BuzzFeed dress? And everybody raised their hand.
Right.
And his question was, Are you BuzzFeed?
Right.
Why are you writing about somebody else's story?
Right. Right.
Uh,
And yeah, that's definitely something that we have a little competition here, which is nice, which is something that's always nice to have. But yeah, because we're hyper local, we're providing something unique to our readers, which is here. I don't really get into state or national issues because there's other better equipped sources to cover that stuff. We don't need to regurgitate something somebody else has already done. We do benefit from having the Virginia Mercury, which is a public newspaper that we can republish from, which is good for covering some of the Richmond stuff. We have the Capital News Service, which is out of Virginia Commonwealth University. It's students covering, during General Assembly sessions and things like that, which is incredibly valuable. So we can cover that at limited cost for us. But yeah, I can have my people doing community news, which is why we're really selling, and that's, the businesses that open, the kids that do well, notable people who are involved in things. Sometimes it's negative stuff too. I mean, we have to cover that, but in general, I think the value of community news and when I talk about the news deserts that have been created, and I'm sure that you've talked with others about that, is I think that we lose that interconnectivity of community. We lose some of knowing what the people across the street are up to, or we didn't know that they were involved in all that. Wow, that's really interesting, And I honestly think that makes what we do, community news, indispensable, because I think ultimately, when you look at how divided we are about politics and things like that in the national stage, it's because we don't see each other as people. We just see each other as check marks or what political party they support or what sign they have in their yard or how big a flag they fly, and so that's, I think that definitely that's one of our strengths, is that we write things that other people don't, and thus we're more efficient.
So this is the part that I'm trying to figure out. As I'm listening to you, it sounds to me like you have a sound business model. Therefore, you don't have to worry about the hedge fund coming to take over because you're not a target for them. You have a sound business model, right? So everybody seems to blame the hedge fund for creating news deserts. But again, putting my MBA hat on, there's a reason these particular newspapers became targets for the hedge funds. Certainly. It's because they were sitting in overpriced buildings. Yeah. And they were spending more money on stuff than they were actually making through advertising, that they became an easy target for somebody to come in and say, I'm going to sell this for parts, I'm going to slash this, and I'm going to milk this cow until it dies, right? But you first have to be a target for a hedge fund before the hedge fund would actually target you. And so isn't the solution for everybody to basically learn from you?
Yeah, so if the world were as great as this, yeah. But no, I think that they need to think beyond, and there are groups out there who are trying to get newspapers to think beyond the traditional model. And there's some newspapers that have done a good job of balancing both their print and their digital assets, and have been successful. It's certainly not, I think of a newspaper chain that I've been involved with on a contractual basis, on and off. They have a number of local weeklies. They do very well, but they've done a good job of merging together their print editions and their online editions and their effectiveness. And they've built up a regional setup so that they can copy share across, so you don't have 5 people going and writing the same thing. You've got one person who covers it and they can share it across the organization. And they've done a very good job of that. And I think those are some of the lessons that can be learned out there. But certainly, you look at the news organizations that are bought out. Some of it is that, they're very good newspapers and they just no one wants to make the investment to buy a newspaper. You almost have to be a philanthropist now to want to buy a news organization, keep it afloat. The Philadelphia Inquirer is a good example of that. And some of these families really just want to get out of the business and liquidate and that, all that. And somebody comes in like an Alden or one of those organizations and offers a lot of money. And it's like, well, now I'm done. I don't have to worry about it anymore. But yeah, a lot of newspapers that have closed or have been bought out have done so because they just, they can't adjust their business model and they haven't been lucrative. So yeah, I do think that they need to learn the lessons out there. And I can also say that I think that some of the legacy organizations kind of look at a digital newspaper and they're just like, they're not a real newspaper. I've run into that too, or people, because we have the relationship with a radio station, they think, oh, that's just the radio station. Radio station's coming out and doing a story on us. And there's a lot of education that I have to do that say, no, we're independent, we're unique. We have this relationship that benefits both of us, but we are an independent, objective news organization.
And it seems like by the time the reader is actually reading what somebody wrote, it doesn't matter whether it first appeared in print or in digital format only, or it was reprinted from somewhere else. Like, they're reading it. That's right. It. The competition's over.
Exactly.
All right. So trying to move forward from this, it seems like a lot of the organizations haven't quite adjusted to the internet. Mm-hmm. And you have these odd temporary effects with Alden and others kind of, let's say, fixing things locally in a way that we don't consider it to be particularly good as a fix. But it is at least a financial fix. It's just not good for society, probably.
Right.
And now AI is coming to the fore. What's about to happen?
Well, we already get people who just, Facebook's a wonderful thing for getting ideas of what people think without any filters. But they'll look at something and go, oh man, look at this. This is obviously written by AI, which is really insulting when someone actually put time and effort into something. But, AI has been something that's been trickling into this for actually longer than people have been aware. I remember reading probably about 10 years ago that AP was going to start doing computer-generated sports stories, game stories based off of box scores and statistics, So, kind of knew this was coming. The current AI boom is, well, it's probably, I say concerning on a number of levels. By saying concerning, I don't mean it's a good or a bad thing. I just mean that it's certainly going to shake up the way things go. We've got to a point where if you can program enough stuff into it, I could probably be having this conversation with you computer generated, because there's enough of my stuff out there, it could approximate some stuff, So, and we hear stories about legal documents being written up by Chat GPT or whatever now, So those are things that definitely are concerning. Anything that makes it cheaper to put together news with less people is concerning to me, because I need to stick around for a few more years. I think it comes down to the same thing, though. It comes down to, what do you provide that's unique? Can AI do unique to a certain area? And there's people who know a lot better than I do. You may be one of them, knowing a little bit about what I've read about you. But, it is. It's that, and as much as it's a fear for what I do, it's also a fear of what people can make it seem that people are saying, especially how many of these interviews do we do now that are remote, where we're not face-to-face with someone, and you can just program something up that you think you're talking to Joe Biden, but you're actually talking to somebody who's got, ulterior motives.
Yeah, that's certainly a separate thing. You mentioned legal brief, so I have to mention probably 2 days ago, a legislator in Arizona used ChatGPT to craft legislation about AI. So
Exactly. And, if a politician's going to find a shortcut, well, they're going to go for it.
but this one is slightly shaky because who's watching the watchers?
Exactly.
But all right, so it's interesting because we mentioned essentially a few different types of AI here. One, coverage of sporting events. I don't even know to what extent that is artificial intelligence. It just seems like automatic data gathering, right? And with sporting events, in many cases, you don't need the human words. You just say the minutes and what happened, and that's pretty much what the person is there to read anyway.
Right.
So why do they need somebody who can write? Then we have large language models, which is what the entire world is crazy about now, right? And those approximate good human writing. And so here I always have my own concern, but I'm always curious what journalists think. Is it primarily a concern because if it can approximate good writing, then journalists who have essentially a monopoly on good writing, other than professional writers, are suddenly facing competition from something much, much cheaper? On the other hand, well, maybe if we already have 50 articles about the exact same event, 48 of them do not require a human, and the human can go and do something more productive, like gather more things that people want to know about that others haven't written about yet. So I don't know what your view on this is, but just to kind of finish this rant, and then you mentioned deepfakes, or at least alluded to them. That one's interesting. We have an engineer in Pakistan who, right before they had the election this year, got a robocall from Imran Khan himself telling him to boycott the election. And obviously, Imran Khan wasn't sitting there calling the 120 million people who voted for him or something like this to not show up this time. Right? But it looks like all the past voters of Imran Khan were getting calls from Imran Khan himself. So, and not all of them are engineers. I assume quite a few of them believed it. I think we're going to see something like this year as well. Anyway, this was a lot. I don't know which one's my question. Let's talk about the writing stuff, the LLMs. What do you think is both the possible upside and the possible downside here?
Obviously, there are things that, it can make things easier. There are things, if you're just regurgitating statistics or fact, that you have a good source for sports roundups, for instance. On the other hand, that may be good for something that's brief or whatever. But if you want more in-depth reporting, then you get to the art of it. You get the reporter asking certain questions and being able to get quotes out of people and things like that. So, there's definitely the idea, and I'm not anti-technology. My father was a computer programmer. I was using computers, back before anybody I knew had them, really, and every step of the way, technology has made things easier. And I think that AI is something that can do that. I'm always, on the other hand, worried about maintaining my phony baloney job. So
that seems to be a concern people have. Yes.
Yeah. So I like going places, having a roof, and eating and things. So, but I do think it makes the role of an editor that much more important, because you have to be able to, you had to pick out things that we can't say that, we have to be careful there. We need, what is the source for this? That sort of thing. It makes editors have to ask those questions that much closer, because as especially, I know it's going to get better, but right now we can make things sound very much like the real deal with AI. But there are times that it gets off the reservation a little bit. And, it's like, I think it makes our job as reporters and editors that much more important in being able to discern what is and not accurate, and do the research and the background and make sure that it's there. So
are you at some point going to see a bifurcation of sort of the PI part of the work and the writer's part of the work, because the writing is taken care of by something not human?
I think that there will be somewhere along that line in there. There will be, it will move to where we'll be getting more of an assist from artificial intelligence. And yeah, I mean, each technology frees people up to be doing more and be doing different. So, I can see some positive aspects for that. But right now, I think everybody's hopping on the train, but I'm not so sure that we've proven that it's, really there yet.
Yeah, as somebody from inside the industry, it's there.
Yeah, yeah. All right. See,
I
and
mean, it's just what you're seeing right now and what people are typically playing with are products that aren't tuned for the use case.
Sure.
Right? So they're going to something like ChatGPT and they're asking, write me an article that's just as good as the New York Times. Well, ChatGPT is not trained to write articles. It's trained to write everything based on everything it's seen, which is the entire internet. So obviously it's not going to be able to narrow down and do it as well. But if you fine tune a model, the writing is really good. It just has no idea what to write about.
Right.
So if you don't give it some inputs and you just tell it, write me an article, then it's going to sound very sterile. It will have nothing inside of it, right? But if you give it a set of facts and you say, describe those facts well, and you fine tune to that model, then I don't know, my prediction here is, I don't know if you want to say optimistic or pessimistic, depending on which side of this ledger you're on, right? But my prediction is by the end of this year, models will write better than most journalists.
I would not necessarily argue with you on that. I do believe in, for one, trusting an expert, but two, I've read a lot of what reporters write, and not all of them write very well anyway.
Right. So
but certainly, I could see that. That's interesting. That's very interesting.
I mean, this is the other thing, right? You have a bell curve distribution of writing, and let's say most journalists are somewhere above the 90th percentile, but not all of them are in the 0.1 or 0.01, right?
Right.
And so the curve of AI is moving to the right. It's already somewhere in the tail because it's clearly writing better than the vast majority of, well, I think 18% of Americans are functionally literate, right? So that's an easy bar to cross, the first 82%. But yeah, it's progressing.
That's interesting. It's interesting.
Let me shift to something else that I kind of bookmarked in my head from the very beginning, which is this shift of the interests of the readers from the local to the national. It seems to have started somewhere around the 90s, and now it's coming to the point where the reader is so interested in the national that that's what the local politicians are beginning to talk about, right? So clearly that's what sells, right? You didn't have local school board elections be about yes, Trump, no Trump, right? But now they are, which means that's what the voters are reading, which means that's what they're interested in. And that might be in part why local media organizations aren't getting the eyeballs they used to get. Why did this happen? Is this just the media ecosystem and social media driving all of this? Or is there an actual loss of interest in the public? And what happened in the next street when it's so easy to find out all the melodrama in Washington?
So where do I think that started to change? I think that started to change partially because of what we did, but also partially because of politics became more contentious on the national level. Well, they were starting to get there in the Clinton administration, but I think that the wars and the Bush administration really kind of put people into teams, my team and their team, politically. And some of that was fueled by the rise of talk radio, the rise of talk television, political television, whether that be MSNBC or Fox. And I think people started tuning to that, really. And it became, for the average person, we used to think all the politicians were either out there to do good for us or they were all going to tax us. But it became much more a part of their news consumption was watching these talking heads on these networks yell at each other. And I think that, the explosion of cable television, all this helped feed into that. and people have a limited bandwidth for the amount of stuff that they can consume, and at the same time, newspapers, I think, started to feed into that a little bit by covering more national stuff than local stuff. I think you saw that some of that was because, and it kind of ties into the AI thing too, but as they trimmed staff and such, they would pull more from wire services and cover more national and state house type stuff. And because,
So sorry to interrupt, but I think this is what I'm trying to figure out. Is this a rational response to changing consumer demands? Or the demands being driven by something?
Well, I think it's probably a little both, really. It's this idea that, we got to meet the reader where they're at. We got to sell our papers. So they want more of this national stuff. They want more commentary. We'll throw in more commentary. We'll get more of these syndicated columnists in there. We don't have to pay, we don't have to pay somebody local to do it. We can just start getting this stuff. And so I think it started to chew into some of the local reporting too. But I do, I really do, and I think I alluded to this in the beginning, the younger people who are coming out of journalism school now, I think that they're, they have this ingrained sense, whether it came from outside or if it came from their education, of this is right and this is wrong, and I'm going to tell you what's right. And I think that's definitely permeated into such. So I think, I think it all feeds itself. Some of it was people were changing what they were consuming, and some of it was the news industry trying to meet them somewhere.
Guess what I'm trying to figure out is whether it's reversible, or if I try to rephrase that. Right now, local newspapers are dying because they're basically creating an inferior version of what national newspapers are creating. Mm-hmm. And so their product is not differentiated. Nobody reads it. They keep blaming the monetization method. Again, I'm giving the worst version here, right? Mm-hmm. But the problem is not the monetization, it's that nobody wants the product. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're coming to them and let's say we tell them, here's the solution. First of all, cut your unnecessary costs like printing and delivering stuff by truck. But second of all, try to create the product nobody else is creating. Create a product by investigating only local stories because you're best positioned to do that. And my question is it going to solve the problem? Or will they do all that and find out nobody wants to read the local stories anyway?
No, I think that they will. I think that they will read them. I think that our success is is proof of that. That, the thing that we do so well, and we cover government stuff, but we don't get into it like newspapers used to do it. I mean, we used to have a reporter sitting there by the local courthouse all the time, ready to jump in on all these meetings. And we do it, more on a basis of, hey, this is a big issue that's coming up. We're going to pay attention to this and see how it goes through. But, all this change in the way that people are reading the news and everything, what they're losing is people who are keeping an eye on local government and local issues and keeping people honest. And it's been proven that in those areas, the cost of governance goes up. And when you start having a news organization that's paying attention, and suddenly these, government organizations have to actually answer to somebody, it kind of brings things in line. Part of the reason that it's really, I think, really difficult for people locally to influence what's going on without a local news source to keep an eye on such is that people are so busy these days. Local government will say, well, all of our board of supervisor meetings are streamed online. You can watch all those. Or, you can come here in person and talk. Well, these meetings go 4 or 5 hours. When you've got kids in athletics or music or something like that, and you're running around trying to do stuff in a couple hours, do your grocery shopping after work because everybody's working long hours, nobody wants to sit in a meeting for 4 or 5 hours. But if you've got a local news organization who says, hey, this is a big issue here, and look what your person said, and, really kind of put that together, that was always the traditional role that we played so well. And that, I think, sells. We get a lot of traffic on our local government stuff. We get a lot of traffic on just the local stories about people who are doing great things in the community, and these are the things that people are always interested in hearing a good story about someone that maybe they've seen a few times or whatever. These are the things that we can provide and sell and can really do it. And I do think that ultimately where we're at right now, as divided as we are politically on, well, really all the way up now. I mean, if you're a Republican, you're going to vote Republicans. If you're Democrat, you're going to vote Democrats. There's very little crossover between those people who are really invested in that stuff. But, myself being a very strongly independent person, I can see that there are more and more people who are saying, whoa, wait a minute, let's reel this all back in a little bit. And I think that that's going to change. It may be more of a generational change. I used to say maybe it's when the boomers retire, but my generation's getting up there too. And maybe it's got to get rid of us too. But,
this goes back to, I think, Max Planck, which is science progresses one funeral at a time, right?
So I do think that it will swing back this way. I don't believe a vacuum, a local news vacuum, is sustainable. I think someone's going to look at that and say, wait a minute, we can jump in here. And I've seen other news organizations locally that have started to pop up in the area. And it's like, well, they kind of looked at us and said, hey, maybe that's the way to do it, because they're emulating our model, pretty closely. So
I guess, would you want to see tech companies try to get into that market, or is that best left to journalists? Like if a company like ours decided, hey, we can get the transcripts from these 3,000 municipalities because they'll use the same format, scrape them and make them more easily discoverable, would that be a good thing, or would that actually be a bad thing to do?
I think it has the potential to be a good thing. I think it all depends on who's monitoring the scraping. You know what I mean? I think potentially there's promise to, anytime more information is available, I think it's important. But I think sometimes too, like I say, people are busy. I think sometimes having something packaged and presented to them makes it much more palatable, especially if you can take the language of municipal government or local police reports and actually translate it into real English for the layman,
Well, without distorting it, hopefully, because right. I've seen quite a few examples where even what you would consider very respectable news organizations, AP, UPI, places like that, right? Where I read a local law that was passed, let's say in Oregon, and then I read the article that's written about it, and I notice a language substitution. Right? The law in Oregon used, let's say, the Republican framing on that topic, and the substitution uses the Democratic framing, which you can argue which one is correct, but obviously that is trying to inject something else into it, right? You're no longer reporting what the Republicans in Oregon passed. You're kind of trying to influence what your reader is going to think about it.
A good example of that, I was reading an article several years ago. It was the reason I stopped my subscription to the Washington Post. And I forget exactly what it was now, but it was a military reporter. I worked for Stars and Stripes for 13 years. So I have a very much an interest in military reporting and topics. But he had written something, and then a very obvious clarification had been added to it afterwards that I looked at that. I said, well, an editor inserted that. I could just tell it wasn't the same. It was on the same guy. And I looked at the clarification and I said, but that's opinion. What you just inserted in there was opinion. He was quoting something, and I think, and when we talk about trust and things like that in the news, I think, who the gatekeepers are and what they're bringing to the table, is hugely important. And again, why at newspapers that I've worked at in the past several years, actually almost the past 10 years now, we've tried to make it a point that philosophically we play it down the middle. We don't get involved in that kind of analysis.
So let me ask you a question then, because I now remember what the example from Oregon is that I was talking about. Well, while you were talking, I kind of brought it back to the forefront of my mind. And it's one that I don't know how I would reconcile myself, right? So the law was something that placed restrictions on gender transition surgeries.
Okay.
And the UPI article wrote that they banned certain types of gender affirming care. Now, they're clearly describing the same thing, right? UPI did not add any note or opinion to it. All they did was a subtle shift of language from one that assumes this is a limit on transition, right?
Right.
To another that assumes that this is a limit on affirming.
Right.
Right. I don't know which of these frames is correct, but is it intellectually honest from a journalist to create that transition to begin with compared to the original language of the law that was passed? Or if you're an editor, how do you handle that?
It's hard. As an editor, it's hard because you have to have some trust in the people that you have gathering the news, because you can't catch it all. Sometimes you'll read something like I did with that article in the Washington Post and say, whoa, wait a minute. Or you'll read something and say, who's saying this? Where are you getting this from? But your example is much more of changing a word and changing something into kind of what's a trigger word for a lot of people. You throw a word out there like ban, and suddenly, people are pulling on their jerseys and, picking teams again. But I think the problem is for editors, I think, is the amount of stuff that they're pushing through and trying to catch it all. And it's a quick business. This gets into another thing that that happens. Everybody loves to point out a mistake, right? And it used to be they'd have to write a letter to the editor or whatever. Now they just comment in an email. They'll send you an email. You got to do better than that. You used the wrong word there. And it's like, well, yeah, it is the wrong word and it was a mistake, but I did edit 18 stories that day. And I'm sure that you made a mistake in your job at one time or another. And it's one of those things that, you've constantly got to be on guard for the language that's used and try to get it as much as you can. I don't know if that change was made just because someone said, that's awkward, that's better, without calculating in their head, well, wait a minute, that's not better because now I just said something else.
Yeah. Well, it seems thematic though, right? It seems like there's just an editorial policy somewhere to say, don't call it gender transitions, call it gender affirming.
Right.
Which is a big question I have in my mind. Because again, I don't know which of these frames is correct, but they are the opposite frame of the same issue. Right? One assumes you start at X and transition to Y. The other one assumes that you were Y all along and you're just affirming it now, right? They cannot both be correct. But if I were to automate this and write a model that does this instead of an editor, the model would never change the original frame of the legislation because then you're not really reporting what the legislation said, right? You're reporting that plus something of your own that may or may not be better. But is this the right way to approach it? Or is it better to have an editorial policy that says, here's the list of hot topics right now, here's the words that we use for each one?
Well, I think that is an example of something that should be used to an extent, but again, it has to be put together by an idea of, these are the terms that we're going to use, but, people from a lot of varying standpoints came together and came up with some of these ideas. But it's so subjective, isn't it? It's really subjective. It's like in a perfect world, you'd be like, yeah, we're going to use these terms and not these terms. But when somebody says something, when that's their words, shouldn't that be paramount?
And in this case, it's not somebody, right? And it's not just words. It's legislation that's in the protocol somewhere.
Yeah.
And besides the use of these terms, and again, I know this example might be flammable, so let's go into other historic stuff, right? This is very Frank Loncian, right? This is death tax territory. It's choosing terms because you want them to elicit a certain effect, right? And you have this fight right now in the US. Again, I've been in the US for 17 years, right? But I'm still coming at this like an immigrant, saying, isn't this interesting what people are doing here? They're coming up with contradictory terms for the same thing and then arguing about which term is correct because the term assumes something or it elicits an emotion that you want to elicit in people.
Right.
But is it not better to just stick to the original if you're reporting on a law? That part I don't get.
Well, I think so, but this idea, it's kind of funny because this idea of total objectivity in journalism is, it's a relatively young idea. This is really an outgrowth of Watergate, that we can affect change. We can say that this is right and that's wrong. And you have to look back on years and years and years of journalism, and we call it yellow journalism now, but there were reasons that newspapers had names like the Independent and the Democrat and the Republican. And they tell you right in the name where they're coming from, So I guess, it's like I said in the beginning, the way that I was taught and brought along as an editor was, you're going to have your opinions and there's places for that you can have those opinions, but you got to check that at the door when you're writing. That's why you talk to people, and that's why you try to flesh it out as much as you can and balance things out. And really, Fox wasn't wrong when they used to promote the phrase, "We report, you decide." They may not have followed it in practice, but it was a great phrase, And that's where I think we really need to be focused. And, as I say, I fear that, the numbers are out there that, the large percentage of journalists who are members of one political party as opposed to another political party in this country, that has to come from somewhere. Some of it, I think, is that journalism is a place where you can make a difference. And sometimes people of those political, ideological persuasions want to be somewhere where they can make a difference. But some of it is just, I think, the way that people are being taught. It's just producing people that think a certain way.
Or you have self-selection, right? If those faculties are already leaning that way, then somebody from the opposite party might not want to join that faculty and spend several years there.
Exactly.
He's going to go and study oil engineering because that's where his ilk are hanging out, right?
Right, exactly. So, and it's, I guess, for me, I know people who are very political. Actually, I have two people I used to work with that are very political on other sides of the spectrum. And I actually kind of looked at that and I said to myself, I'm not going to do that. I used to be, as an opinion writer, I used to write a certain line of thought. But as a journalist, I haven't joined a political party. I don't, I go and I do my duty and I vote for people I think who are best for the job. But it's very important for me to be as independent as I possibly can and try to go into everything that I write or read with a open blank slate and let them tell me and point me towards things and do my research that way. I don't think a lot of people do that. Yeah. And that's maybe somewhere that something can be developed that would help in those areas.
Yeah. So that was my last question, but I do want to kind of continue on this rant that my main criterion when I decide who's a better politician for a particular job is this a competent person? I almost feel like there's something wrong with asking politicians about their opinions on issues all the time. Like, you don't hire a CEO this way. Like, I don't hire a CEO by asking, what is your general opinion on reductions in force, right? If we get to the point where a reduction in force may be an option, we'll discuss that. But I don't choose somebody based on that opinion. I choose somebody based on, okay, you worked at these three companies before. How did they do? Did they outperform expectations? Were the people who worked with you so happy that they're still working for you, et cetera, right? These are the parameters by which you select somebody to manage. And like politicians, we elect them to manage, right?
You want a leader, a manager. And I think people have split away, the idea of a leader is something else. That's, some sort of icon almost.
I mean, it's opinionator in chief, right?
Right. But, you look back at some of our most successful presidents in the history of this country, it's people who have surrounded themselves with people who maybe didn't think like them all the time, but they were able to get ideas from them and take those ideas and to synthesize them and come up with their own, plan of what they wanted to do. It's kind of sad that we're in a place now where what the first thing we have to look at somebody and say is, are you competent? Because you would hope that if they're running, if they're putting themselves applying for that job, that
it's been a while since we saw somebody who was competent. And it's also been a while since we've been surprised. Like, I keep thinking, Bill Clinton balanced the budget. That's surprising, right? The Democrat today wouldn't do that, right?
Yeah.
Or George W. Bush, as much as we hate him for starting a couple of wars, he passed No Child Left Behind and expanded Medicare Part D, right? Which is not something you expect a Republican to do.
Nope.
So I like being surprised by my politicians because that means they're not dogmatic. They're actually talking to experts, following the issues, trying to figure out what's the right thing to do. It doesn't happen very often.
Bush was also before the wars distracted and was making some really great strides on the immigration issues too, that we kicked the can down the road and, we're kind of looking at what we're looking at now, and you can't, one of the things that I think surprised me most about Bush was in New York City, at that moment in time, he was exactly the leader that we needed as a country, and so it has been a long time, and you don't see, if you look at we're getting off the topic here, but if you look at the slates on both parties right now of who's available on the bench, you don't see a lot of people that you're like, that's the next one that's going to pop up here and really surprise us. I think when Clinton appeared in '88, I think he suddenly made a splash that everybody said, wow, this is the guy who's really got the ability to gel that party and push it forward. And, it's been a while. It's been a while.
All right, let's go back to the last question I was planning to ask anyway. And you already alluded to it in some sense, which is, if you had the magic wand, or if you were the dictator of the world and you could tell me what to do and people like me, what would you want us to do?
Well, I think that, as in regards, are you saying in regards to artificial intelligence?
Yeah, like software people, founders of companies, AI developers. What do you want us to do to help this ecosystem?
I think that if we're as close as we are to be able to synthesize fact and put it together in ways that work, I would want someone who would be willing to listen and be guided by people, editors who'd been in this business for a long time, people who could approach it, finding editors with open minds who'd help with that would be a trick. But I do believe that we're out there to find ways that we can reap the benefits and the help and make us more efficient without causing some sort of seismic shift that would shatter credibility of news editing. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, though. I don't think a seismic shift is avoidable.
Well,
So the question is, which one should we cause, or how should we package it? But I don't think I, I keep going back to this analogy, 1920s, and we just started making good tractors, right?
yes,
There's no way that we're not displacing most
sir.
people who till the soil and pick the crops, right? The only question is, how do we do it in a way that produces more food for society and not less food, right?
Well, I think that anything that would make my job easier and free my people up in a way that, like for instance, we do a lot of rewriting of press releases and such for briefs and short stories and things like that. And any aid that we would get there, that we wouldn't be sucking up as much time to do that, where it could just be read over and made sure that we're good with everything, that's always going to be a benefit. Yeah, yeah, we can't have advances in technology without it costing something as far as jobs. But AI is just one thing in our business that we're dealing with. There's lack of benefits for many people. There's lack of pay for many people that ultimately drives them into doing other things. So we have turnover in our business. I think that ultimately artificial intelligence can improve things, and in the end, if it's managed properly, it won't harm those who really do their jobs and do a good job and are dedicated to doing their job. They'll find ways that they have to adapt and change, but they'll find these things.
Right. And on that positive note, I hope that that's going to happen. So thank you so much, Chris. It's been great.
Thanks, you. I really enjoyed this.
This has been another episode of The Otherweb. Join us next time for more discussions on news, media, and everything in between.